One wrong turn, one spilled glass of champagne, one man whose name made bankers sweat and judges look the other way. Vivian Mercer was the last woman who should have ended up in his orbit, a financial investigator who built her entire life on facts, evidence, and keeping dangerous men exactly where they belonged, behind bars or behind walls. Luca Moretti was the last man who should have let her in. But fate doesn't ask permission, and some collisions leave damage you can't audit your way out of. Drop a like. Comment the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Follow me all the way to the end. You won't see this ending coming. The Hamptons had always made Vivian Mercer feel like a fraud. Not the kind of fraud she spent her professional life hunting. The ones who cooked books, shuffled shell companies across 3 continents, buried liabilities in footnotes no one bothered to read. Those frauds she understood. She understood their logic, their greed, their particular brand of arrogance that made them believe they were smarter than every audit trail they left behind. What she didn't understand was this: the particular theater of inherited wealth, the way people moved through a room like they'd been choreographed from birth, the effortless confidence of people who had never once in their lives checked a price tag before buying something. She checked price tags. Even tonight, in a dress that cost more than her first month's rent, on the apartment she'd shared with 2 other women in her late 20s, she had stood in the boutique and done the math 3 times before handing over the card. The Whitmore estate sat at the end of a private drive lined with Japanese maples that had been trimmed to inhuman perfection. The house itself was the kind of structure that stopped being a house somewhere around the 3rd wing. Stone and glass and imported light fixtures that cast everything in a warm, amber glow, designed to make the obscenely rich feel even more comfortable in their obscenity. Vivian had driven up in a rented sedan, watched the valet's eyes slide over the car with the practiced neutrality of someone paid to pretend he didn't notice, and handed over the keys with a smile that said she hadn't noticed him noticing. She was good at that, performing composure. Her cousin Darcy had been glowing for 3 weeks straight, ever since Preston Whitmore III had dropped to one knee on the roof terrace of a restaurant that required a 6-month reservation. Vivian had gotten the call at 11 at night, standing in her office with a cold cup of coffee and a forensic accounting report spread across her desk, and she had said all the right things. Thrilled, so happy for you, he's wonderful, you deserve this. And then she'd sat down in her chair and stared at the ceiling for a long time, feeling something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't jealousy. She didn't think it was jealousy. She thought it might be something lonelier than that. The engagement party had started at 7. Vivian had arrived at 7:42, late enough that she didn't have to stand at the entrance watching other guests arrive, early enough that Darcy wouldn't notice and make a face about it. The moment she stepped through the carved mahogany doors, the noise hit her like a physical thing. 300 people in a space that could hold 500. The acoustics of high ceilings throwing conversation and laughter, and the string quartet's careful Vivaldi up into the rafters and back down again, compressed and overwhelming. She got a glass of champagne from a passing tray. She found Darcy, kissed her cheek, met Preston again, shook the hands of people whose names she immediately lost, smiled and nodded through 3 separate conversations about Manhattan real estate, 1 conversation about a charity polo match, and 1 deeply uncomfortable exchange with a man named Thatcher, who had opinions about the Federal Reserve that Vivian found both uninformed and delivered with the particular confidence of someone who had never been wrong about anything in his own estimation. By 9 o'clock, she needed air that didn't taste like Chanel No. 5 and old money. She moved along the periphery of the main room, keeping close to the walls, edging toward the corridor she'd spotted earlier. A long hallway leading away from the party, lined with portraits of Whitmore ancestors, who all shared the same slightly disapproving set to their mouths. She didn't know where the corridor led. She didn't particularly care. Anywhere quieter than here. She turned the corner and walked directly into a wall of black fabric and what turned out to be a very solid human chest. The champagne went first. Her glass tilted, his tilted, and the collision of crystal and physics sent a wave of cold moe directly down the front of her dress, soaking through the silk in the time it took her to gasp and step back and nearly lose her heel on the marble floor. "Oh, I'm sorry," she started. "My fault." The voice was quiet, controlled. Not the reflex apology of someone embarrassed, Something more deliberate than that, like a man who'd learned to moderate every response before it left his mouth. She looked up. The man standing in front of her was tall in a way that registered before anything else. Not imposing exactly, but present. The kind of physical presence that a room rearranged itself around. He was somewhere in his early 40s, dark hair gone slightly silver at the temples, a face that was handsome in the way that certain landscapes are handsome, structured, unforgiving, not designed to make you comfortable. He was wearing a suit that cost more than Vivian's car, and he was holding what remained of his champagne with the stillness of someone who had decided not to react. His eyes were dark, very dark, and they were looking at her with an attention that felt different from the way people usually looked at her, not assessing her dress or her credentials or her connection to the Whitmore family, just looking, like he was genuinely trying to understand something about her face. "Are you—" she started. "Fine." He glanced down at her dress. "You're not." "It's just champagne." "It's down your front." "I'm aware." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The suggestion of one, maybe. The ghost of an expression that had learned not to complete itself in public. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a folded pocket square, white linen, and held it out to her. She took it without thinking, pressed it against the wet silk. It smelled faintly of cedar and something else, something darker and quieter, the kind of scent that took up space without announcing itself. "Vivian Mercer," she said, because the silence had stretched one beat past comfortable, and she had learned years ago that she was better at filling silence than waiting in it. "I know who you are," he said. She looked up sharply. "You did the Callaway audit," he said, 18 months ago. "You found what 3 other firms missed. You follow forensic accounting?" The words came out flatter than she intended, edged with the skepticism she usually kept better hidden. "I follow people who are very good at what they do." He took the pocket square back from her, folded it without looking at it, replaced it in his pocket. "Luca Moretti." She knew the name. Of course she knew the name. You spent enough time in the financial world of the northeastern United States, and the name Luca Moretti surfaced eventually, attached to investment portfolios that performed with suspicious consistency, to development projects that materialized in neighborhoods that hadn't yet been declared desirable, to boardrooms where people spoke carefully and a particular undercurrent of anxiety ran beneath the professional courtesy. There were other things attached to his name, too, things that lived in whispers rather than official records, in the spaces between what could be proven and what everyone who paid attention already understood. She kept her face neutral, professionally neutral. The expression she'd spent 15 years perfecting for rooms where showing what you knew was less useful than appearing not to know it. "Mr. Moretti," she said. "Ms. Mercer." He inclined his head half a degree, an acknowledgement, not a bow. "Enjoy the rest of your evening." He moved past her. The corridor was wide enough that he didn't have to brush against her. He didn't. She stood there for a moment with cold champagne soaking through to her skin and the ghost of cedar in the air around her, and she told herself the feeling in her chest was nothing more than the mild social disruption of bumping into a stranger. The slight elevated pulse of surprise. She was very good at identifying the right explanation for things. She went to find the bathroom, cleaned up as well as she could, and went back to the party. She did not think about dark eyes and the suggestion of a smile for the rest of the night. Not more than twice. She found the music room by accident. It was past 11, the party showing no signs of contracting, and Vivian had done another circuit of the main rooms and exhausted the last of her reserves for small talk somewhere around the dessert table. She had started looking for a place to sit that wasn't surrounded by people when she pushed open a door at the far end of the east wing that turned out not to be a sitting room. It was long and high-ceilinged, with dark wood paneling and built-in shelving that held instruments she could recognize. A cello in a case, violin, a brass horn of some kind. The dominant feature was the piano, a 9-foot Steinway concert grand that sat at the room's center like it owned the space, polished to black mirror brightness, lid raised. Someone was sitting at it, She nearly backed out. The impulse was immediate. This was clearly a private moment she'd intruded. She should close the door quietly and leave. But her heel caught the door's edge as she tried to retreat, and it swung wider instead of closed. the hinges making a soft sound in the quiet room, and the figure at the piano stopped. Luca Moretti looked over his shoulder at her. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. The party was a distant murmur through the walls, string quartet replaced by a DJ somewhere, bass notes bleeding through the plaster. In here, the silence had weight. "I was leaving," Vivian said. "You could stay." He said it without inflection. An option presented, not an invitation in any conventional sense. He turned back to the keys and played 3 notes. Low, deliberate, testing something. She should have left. She knew she should have left. She stood in the doorway for another 4 seconds, which was 3 seconds longer than necessary, and then she stepped inside and closed the door behind her. She sat in a chair near the bookshelf, close enough to hear clearly, far enough to maintain the geometry of not quite staying. He didn't look at her again. His hands moved across the keys. Not performing, she understood that immediately. He was playing the way people do when they think no one is listening, or when they've decided it doesn't matter if someone is. Fragments, mostly. A phrase repeated, varied, a section that might have been something classical if he'd continued it, but dissolved instead into something slower, more personal. She didn't know music the way some people did, but she knew when someone was telling the truth about something, and the man at the piano was telling the truth. "You don't seem like someone who plays piano," she said. He let the last chord fade. "No." "How long?" "Since I was 8. A pause. "My mother insisted." "Mine insisted on piano lessons too. I lasted 4 months." "You quit." "I was terrible." "That's not why people quit." He played a single note. Let it die. They quit because it requires patience with imperfection. Most people find that intolerable. She looked at his hands on the keys. They were not the hands she would have expected. No excess rings, no particular display of wealth or status. Just hands. Capable. Slightly scarred across the knuckles of the right hand. Old damage, long healed. "What are you doing in here?" she asked. "Same as you. Escaping. You know 300 people out there by name. That's not the same as wanting to be with them." He lifted his hands from the keys, rested them in his lap, and turned to look at her directly. In the lower light of the music room, his face was different from the corridor. Less armored. Not soft. That was the wrong word. But less constructed. "You researched me." "When I saw you coming back to the party, yes." He nodded, unsurprised. "And? And your public profile is very carefully assembled." "Most public profiles are. Yours more than most." He held her gaze. "What do you want to know?" "Nothing," she said. "That's not what I do at parties." "What do you do at parties, Ms. Mercer?" "Survive them." This time the corner of his mouth completed the movement. Just briefly. Not a full smile. Not something she'd be able to describe precisely to someone else, but real. The first completely unguarded expression she'd seen from him, and it lasted less than 2 seconds before his face settled back into its professional neutrality. "Then we have that in common," he said. She stayed for 40 minutes. She would account for this later in ways that made sense. She was tired, the chair was comfortable, the room was quiet. There was no reason to go back out to the party. All of that was true. None of it was the whole truth. They talked about things that weren't dangerous. Music. The Whitmore Estate's architecture. He knew more about it than she expected. Could identify the period of the East Wing's addition. Knew the name of the architect. She talked about a building in her neighborhood she'd been watching change for 3 years. The way the light hit it differently in winter. He listened without performing attention. He just listened. When she finally stood to leave, he walked with her to the door and held it open. In the brighter light of the corridor, the armor came back. Not aggressively, but visibly, the way a face arranges itself for public consumption. "Good night, Miss Mercer," he said. "Good night, Mr. Moretti." She paused. Something made her pause. "You play well." "I play honestly," he said. "That's not the same thing." She walked back toward the party and didn't look back, and the bass notes from the DJ's speakers swallowed the silence of the room she'd left behind, and she told herself the 40 minutes meant nothing beyond what they were. 2 strangers at a party, a quiet room, ordinary conversation, that was all. The drive back to the city took 2 hours. She sat in the back of the rideshare she'd booked and watched the Long Island darkness unroll outside the window, and thought about the Callaway audit, the Hendricks brief she needed to finish by Friday, the deposition she was prepping for next week. Work. Solid, provable, quantifiable work. She did not think about cedar. She did not think about the way someone could play piano as though confessing something. She got home at 1:30 in the morning, showered the champagne out of her hair, and was in bed by 2. She lay in the dark for a while with her eyes open, looking at the ceiling, the city's ambient light bleeding pale orange around the edges of her curtains. She slept. She didn't dream about anything she could remember. She was good at that, too. Monday came with the particular brutality of Mondays in October. The light turned thin and cold overnight, and the city moved with its shoulders up around its ears, everyone recalibrating for the season. Vivian was at her desk by 7:15, which was normal. She had coffee from the Greek diner 3 blocks over, which was also normal. She pulled up the Hendricks brief and worked for 2 hours without looking up, which was the closest she ever got to peace. Her firm occupied the 14th floor of a building on Lexington, not the gleaming glass towers of Midtown's upper 50s, not the self-consciously cool loft conversions of the financial district's edges. The 14th floor of a building where the elevator sometimes required a second button press, where the windows faced a slightly disappointing view of another building's mechanical infrastructure, where the carpet in the conference room had been replaced 3 years ago and still smelled faintly of the adhesive underneath. She had worked here for 9 years. She was a senior investigator. She turned down the partnership offer twice. She didn't want the administrative weight. She wanted the work. The work was what she understood. Numbers were not sentimental. Discrepancies didn't have moods. A falsified entry in a ledger was what it was, regardless of who you were or how much power you believed you had. And the satisfaction of locating the exact point of deception in a financial record was the cleanest feeling she knew. She did not tell people this at parties because it read as deeply unromantic, but it was the truest thing about her. Marcus, her associate, appeared in her doorway at 9:15 with his laptop and the expression of someone who had found something. Marcus was 28 and still at the stage of his career where discoveries made him visibly excited, which Vivian found both endearing and, on slower days, slightly exhausting. "Hendrick's subsidiary," he said, coming in and turning the laptop to face her without being invited, which was also normal. "There's a dormant holding company in Delaware that processed 11 transfers over 14 months, each one under the reporting threshold. Structuring? Almost certainly. But there's a problem." He pointed at the screen. "The company's listed beneficial owner is deceased, died 4 years ago. And the transfers kept happening, for 3 years after his death." Marcus looked up. Someone kept him alive on paper. Vivian leaned back in her chair. "Pull all the signatory authorizations, bank records for the holding company, every document filed with the state since the formation date." She paused. "And find out who was named executor of the estate." Marcus nodded, already moving. At the door he stopped. "Good weekend?" "Whitmore engagement party." "How was it?" "It was a party," she said. "Fine." He went back to his desk. She turned to her screen and pulled up the Delaware registry and started cross-referencing names, and the morning moved the way mornings were supposed to move. Forward, purposeful, one provable fact at a time. She was 3 hours into the Hendricks work when her assistant knocked and said there was a courier delivery marked personal and set an envelope on her desk that was heavier than it looked. Cream paper, no return address, her name handwritten in an even script that took up exactly the space it needed and no more. She opened it. Inside was a letter on corporate stationery, Moretti Capital Advisors, and a formal offer of engagement for a financial audit of Meridian Pacific Holdings, one of Moretti Capital's legitimate investment portfolios. The audit scope was detailed, professionally assembled, the compensation number in the second paragraph landing with the particular weight of a figure that had been chosen to be impossible to decline without good reason. At the bottom of the letter, below the signature, a handwritten addition. "You mentioned the Callaway methodology. I believe we have a situation that requires exactly that approach." L.M. Vivian read it twice, set it down, picked it up and read it again. Then she set it down once more, folded her hands on top of it, and sat very still for a moment. She was aware of several things simultaneously. The offer was legitimate. She could verify that in an hour. Meridian Pacific was a real entity. Its financials were available in fragments through public filings, and a sophisticated audit of a portfolio that size was the kind of engagement that built careers and reputations. The compensation was extraordinary but not implausible for the scope. She was also aware that the man who had sent it had been sitting at a piano 3 nights ago playing something that sounded like the inside of a confession, and that she had stayed for 40 minutes when she should have left in 5, and that she had not stopped thinking about it with the complete and total absence of thought she'd intended. She had a protocol for conflicts of interest. She had built that protocol herself over 15 years because she understood that the most dangerous moment in any investigation was not when you found the deception. It was when you found someone you wanted to trust. She looked at the offer. She looked at the compensation figure. She looked at the name at the bottom. Then she picked up her phone and called the partner at her firm who handled new client intake. "I need a conflict check run," she said. "Moretti Capital Advisors, Meridian Pacific Holdings, full screen. I'll get it to you by end of day. This afternoon," she said. "Please." She hung up. She picked up the letter again and slid it into the folder on her desk where she kept pending reviews, the clean manila folder with nothing else in it, and she went back to the Hendricks brief and worked through lunch without stopping. The conflict check came back clean at 3:47. No existing relationships, no prior engagements, no flags. She sat with that for a while. Then she drafted a reply that was professional, measured, expressed appropriate due diligence interest, and requested a formal meeting to discuss the scope of engagement before any commitment was made. She read it over, changed 2 words, sent it. She told herself this was a business decision, the kind she made routinely with the same assessment methodology she applied to every new client: risk profile, scope clarity, professional exposure, compensation justification. She told herself this right up until she was locking her office at 7 in the evening, and her assistant said goodnight, and she stepped into the elevator alone. The doors closed. She stood there in the small descending box and admitted, in the privacy of a moment no one would ever see, that she had sent the reply because of a man she should not trust, playing piano like he had nothing left to hide. Then the elevator reached the lobby, and the doors opened, and she walked out into the October cold and did not admit it again. Basset. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday afternoon. Moretti Capital's offices on the 52nd floor of a building in Midtown that announced itself without apology. Glass and steel, and the kind of lobby where the security desk was staffed by people in suits rather than uniforms, because the security at that level wasn't meant to look like security. Vivienne arrived 7 minutes early, which was exactly on time by her personal calculation. She was wearing the gray suit she wore for depositions. Professional enough to signal she was serious, understated enough to signal she didn't need to perform seriousness. She carried her briefcase with the strap over her shoulder. She had reviewed everything publicly available on Meridian Pacific the night before and written 3 pages of preliminary questions. The receptionist walked her through a corridor that smelled of something subtle and expensive. Real wood, climate-controlled air, the specific absence of anything harsh, to a conference room where water was already set out, and the view of Manhattan's midtown grid spread 52 floors below like an aerial diagram of ambition. She had been there 4 minutes when Luca Moretti came in. He was not alone. He brought a woman named Claire Weston, his chief legal officer, who had the precise manner of someone who processed information very quickly and revealed nothing about that processing. He brought a man named Dominic Reyes, described as director of portfolio operations, who was younger than Vivienne expected and said almost nothing in the 2 hours that followed. Luca himself shook her hand across the conference table with a grip that was firm without performance, made the briefest possible eye contact that acknowledged they had met before without calling attention to it, and then proceeded to conduct a business meeting. He was impressive at it. She had expected that, but she hadn't expected the particular form it took. Not the domineering presence she'd encountered in other high-net-worth clients, the ones who used meetings as opportunities to remind you of the asymmetry of power. He listened more than he spoke. When he spoke, it was precise. He asked her 2 questions about her methodology that were not standard questions. They were the questions of someone who had actually read her prior work, or read about it, who understood the specific approach that made the Callaway audit successful. "The scope we're proposing," he said, sliding a document across the table toward her, "is complex because Meridian Pacific has 15 subsidiary structures across 4 jurisdictions. We've had audits before. They've been thorough. A pause. We don't believe they've been thorough enough. What makes you believe that? An anomaly I noticed 18 months ago that my internal team couldn't trace to a satisfactory explanation. He kept his voice even. I want it traced. And if the trace leads somewhere uncomfortable? He held her gaze. That's why I'm hiring someone who isn't comfortable with comfortable answers. Claire Weston had a folder open in front of her and was taking notes that Vivian noticed were very specific, not summary notes, verbatim capture. Recording without recording. Vivian filed that. The meeting ran 90 minutes beyond the original schedule because Vivian had questions that required real answers, and she had never learned how to accept incomplete ones. At 4:45, they had a preliminary framework for engagement scope. Nothing was signed. Nothing was committed. The next step was a formal proposal from Moretti Capital, and a 2-week period of formal review on Vivian's side before any agreement. Professional, structured, correct. She was gathering her documents when Luca said, quietly, in the way that meant it was for her and not the room, "You didn't have to take this meeting." "No," she agreed. "I didn't." "What made you?" She looked up at him across the conference table. Claire Weston was talking quietly to Dominic Reyes near the door. They weren't listening. She said, "You called it a situation that required a specific approach. Most clients describe what they want to find. You described what you were afraid of finding." He was still. "And?" "People who are afraid of what they'll find usually have a reason to look anyway. That's the kind of client I do my best work for." He nodded. "Once. I'll have the proposal to you by end of next week." "I'll read it carefully," she said. She left the conference room without looking back, rode the elevator down 52 floors, and walked out into the October afternoon with the city's noise hitting her all at once after the climate-controlled silence of the 52nd floor. She stood on the sidewalk for exactly 3 seconds, recalibrating. Then she started walking toward the subway, briefcase strap across her shoulder, going over the meeting in her mind with the methodical precision she always used to process new information. What had been said, what hadn't been said, what the gap between those two things might contain. She was very good at reading gaps. The thing she didn't read yet, walking in the October cold with the city moving around her and 12 blocks to the nearest express train, was the thing she would spend weeks trying not to understand. That the anomaly Luca Moretti had spent 18 months unable to explain to his satisfaction was not entirely in the accounts of Meridian Pacific Holdings. Some of it was something else entirely, something neither of them had a methodology for. Plus, she accepted the engagement 11 days later. The proposal was thorough. Better than thorough, actually, which annoyed her slightly because she'd been hoping to find something inadequate in it that would give her a clean professional reason to decline. Instead, it was precise, well-structured, demonstrated a genuine understanding of what a Meridian Pacific audit would require, and attached a data access protocol that addressed exactly the concerns she'd raised in the meeting before she'd raised them in writing. Either Moretti Capital had an excellent legal team, or Luca Moretti had read her preliminary questions and assembled his proposal around them. She suspected both. She signed the engagement agreement on a Tuesday and started work on Wednesday. Her access credentials to Meridian Pacific's financial systems appeared in her inbox at 8:02 in the morning, 12 minutes after the signed agreement was received, which told her things about how closely he was watching the process. The first 2 weeks were data acquisition. She built the map: entities, subsidiaries, intercompany transactions, beneficial ownership chains, jurisdiction filings. Marcus worked with her. They brought in a contract analyst for the volume work, and Vivian spent her days building the architecture of the thing before she started looking for where it was wrong. She worked from her own office. That was standard. She didn't embed at client sites during the early phases. But Moretti Capital sent resources with a regularity that made it clear they were prioritizing her access. Document packages arrived same day, questions got responses within the hour. Claire Weston was available by phone in a way that suggested she had been specifically instructed to be. On the Thursday of the second week, Luca himself called. "You've been pulling the 2019 intercompany transfers," he said. No preamble. She had. "How do you know that?" "The system logs. I can see what's being accessed." She absorbed that. I wasn't told you had access to the query logs. I don't, technically. A pause. Claire does. She gives me a summary. That's a disclosure gap in your data access protocol. Yes. Another pause. I'm telling you now. She thought about this. Most clients who had that kind of monitoring in place didn't tell you about it. They monitored and said nothing, and the information imbalance was a form of control. He was telling her. He was correcting the imbalance himself. The 2019 transfers, she said, there's a pattern in the quarterly cycles that doesn't align with the stated investment strategy for that period. I'm mapping it. What do you think it is? Too early to say. What do you suspect it is? She paused. I don't work with suspicions. I work with evidence. Understood. And then, before he ended the call, how's your morning going otherwise? The question landed strangely. Not inappropriately, but wrong in its ordinariness. The small domestic inquiry dropped into a professional call without warning or apology. Fine, she said. Busy. I'll let you get back to it. A beat. The coffee in your building's lobby is terrible, by the way. There's a Greek diner 3 blocks east. She went very still. I know, she said carefully. I go there every morning. I know, he said, and ended the call. She sat at her desk for a moment after he hung up, very aware of the fact that he had known where her coffee came from, which meant he had been paying attention to her movements, which was either deeply unsettling or something else she didn't have a clean word for yet. She chose to file it as unsettling. That was the safe choice. She went back to the 2019 transfer records and didn't think about it until she was falling asleep that night. And then she thought about it in the particular way you think about something that doesn't fit the category you've tried to put it in. She didn't sleep well. She told herself it was the audit. The audit was demanding. That was true. It wasn't the whole truth. The pattern in the 2019 transfers took her another week to fully map, and when she had it laid out across 3 screens in her office at 11:30 on a Wednesday night, with Marcus long gone and the building half empty around her, she sat back and looked at what she'd built, and felt the particular cold clarity that came when evidence stopped being suggestive and became definitive. Someone had been siphoning from Meridian Pacific, not clumsily, with sophistication, with patience, using the intercompany structure as a series of pressure valves, moving capital in amounts that individually wouldn't trigger automated flags, collectively representing a diversion of somewhere between $8 and $12 million over a 14-month period. The entry points were clean, the exit points were cleaner, but exit points always had destinations, and destinations left residue, and Vivian had been following residue for 15 years. She picked up her phone. It was 11:40 at night. She thought about waiting until morning. She called him anyway. He answered on the second ring. You found something, he said. Not a question. How do you know I'm not calling about the data access protocol? At 11:40 on a Wednesday. She almost smiled. Didn't. Someone inside your operation has been diverting capital from Meridian Pacific. 14 months, 8 to 12 million. The mechanism is sophisticated. She paused. This is someone with detailed knowledge of your intercompany structure, insider access. The silence on the other end was different from his other silences, not the controlled quiet of a man choosing his words. Heavier than that. How certain are you? He said finally. The structure of the diversion is clear. The attribution will take more work, but the diversion itself, she looked at her screens. Certain. Another silence. Then, are you still at your office? Yes. I'm 20 minutes away. She opened her mouth to say that wasn't necessary, that this could wait until morning, that there was a professional protocol for client notification that did not involve, all right, she said. She hung up the phone and looked at her screens and the evidence laid out across them, and then she looked at the window and the city beyond it, lit and restless and indifferent, and she understood with the particular precision she applied to everything that she had just made a choice that had very little to do with professional protocol. He was going to walk through her door in 20 minutes, and she was going to let him. He arrived in 19 minutes. Vivian heard the elevator before she saw him. The particular sound of it stopping on 14 when the building was otherwise quiet, the way sound traveled differently at night when there was nothing to absorb it. She had used the 19 minutes to print the core documents, arrange them in the order that told the story most clearly, and make a second cup of coffee from the machine in the break room that she didn't actually want but needed something to do with her hands. She was standing at her desk when he walked in. He had come from somewhere. Not home, she registered that immediately. He was still in a suit, jacket on, but the tie was gone and the top button was open, and there was a quality to his movement that suggested he'd been working when she called, not sleeping. He came through the glass door of her office suite, past Marcus's empty desk, and stopped in the doorway of her office proper. He looked at her screens. "Show me," he said. She showed him. She walked him through it the way she walked everyone through it, methodically, building from the foundation, not jumping to the conclusion before the evidence was fully mapped. She explained the intercompany structure first, how Meridian Pacific's 15 subsidiaries created natural channels for legitimate capital movement, how those same channels, properly understood, could be used as cover for systematic diversion. She showed him the transfer pattern, the amounts, the timing, the way each individual transaction sat just below the threshold that would trigger automatic review. He stood beside her desk and watched the screens and said nothing. His hands were in his pockets. His face was the controlled face, the one that gave nothing away. But his jaw was set in a way it hadn't been in the conference room, in the corridor at the Whitmore estate, at the piano. "The exit points," she said, pulling up the third screen. "This is where it gets specific. The capital moved through a series of intermediary accounts, but intermediaries leave traces. The third-tier account in this chain," she pointed, "received transfers from 6 different Meridian subsidiaries over 14 months. 6 subsidiaries with no legitimate operational relationship to each other. The only thing connecting them is this account. Who owns it?" His voice was very quiet. "That's the next stage of the work. Attribution requires, who do you think owns it?" Not a question. A demand, delivered quietly, which was its own kind of pressure. She looked at him. Someone with operational knowledge of all 6 subsidiaries. Someone who understood the audit schedule well enough to time the transfers between reviews. Someone who had authorization-level access to the intercompany transfer systems. She paused. "You have how many people at that access level?" The muscle in his jaw moved. 11. "Then you have 11 suspects." He turned away from the screens and walked to the window. The city was out there doing what the city did at midnight. Not sleeping, not fully awake. The lights of office buildings where the cleaners worked their way up floor by floor, the red trail of taillights on Lexington below. He stood with his back to her for a moment, and she watched him breathe. 8 to 12 million, he said. Conservative estimate, the full accounting may be higher. Over 14 months. Beginning in March of 2022. He was still. Then, that's when I reorganized the subsidiary structure, new access protocols. I brought 3 new people into the operational tier. That narrows it. He turned back. His eyes were very dark and very direct, and there was something in them she hadn't seen before. Not anger, exactly. Something colder and more controlled than anger, which was somehow worse. "I need a name." "I know you do, and I'll get you one. But I need 2 more weeks minimum to trace the attribution chain without making errors I can't walk back. 2 weeks. Forensic attribution done wrong is worse than no attribution. If you act on incomplete evidence and it's wrong, I know what happens if it's wrong." The words came out flat, clipped, carrying a weight she didn't push on. She understood that for him, wrong attribution wasn't a professional setback. It was something else entirely. 2 weeks, she said again. "Let me finish it properly." He held her gaze for a long moment, then he nodded. One motion, decisive, and the tension in the room reconfigured itself, not gone, but redirected. He looked at the documents she'd printed spread across the edge of her desk. "Can I take these?" "Not the originals. I'll have copies made tomorrow." "Tomorrow morning." First thing. He picked up his jacket from where he'd laid it over the chair. He was leaving, she thought. Good. It was past midnight and she had work to do and he should leave. At the door he stopped. "You called me at 11:40, he said. "You said you wanted to know." "I did." He looked at her across the office. "You could have waited until morning. It would have been the correct professional choice." She held his gaze. "Yes." "Why didn't you?" She had an answer ready. The professional version, the one about client urgency and time-sensitive information. She didn't use it. Because you've been straight with me about things other clients hide. The monitoring logs, the conflict of interest. You've been straight. She paused. So was I. Something happened in his face. Small, controlled, but there. Good night, Ms. Mercer. Good night. He left. She listened to the elevator descend. She stood in her office for a moment, surrounded by her screens and her evidence and the faint smell of cedar that had no business being in her office at midnight, and then she sat down and went back to work. The 2 weeks were the most intense of the audit. She drove the work hard, pushed Marcus harder than was fair, stayed late every night and came in early every morning, living on the Greek diner coffee and the particular focused energy that came when a complex problem was close to resolution. Luca didn't call again. He texted. Brief, factual, always relevant. A data point she hadn't asked for that turned out to matter. A document that hadn't been in the original package. A note that Claire Weston had flagged a discrepancy in the 2023 filings that Vivian might want to cross-reference. He was good at giving her exactly what she needed without crossing the line into directing the investigation. She noticed this. She noticed the precision of it, the control it required. On the Thursday of the second week, she got a delivery to her office. No note, no card, just a coffee from the Greek diner in a paper cup with the lid on, still hot, exactly how she ordered it. Her assistant said a car had dropped it off. She sat looking at it for a full minute before she drank it. She drank it. She didn't say anything about it when Luca texted that afternoon about a subsidiary filing. She didn't say anything about it the next day either. But the morning after that, there was another cup, and the morning after that, and she understood she had made a choice by not addressing it, a choice she couldn't precisely categorize, which was the kind of thing she usually refused to allow. Attribution came on a Friday. The third-tier account resolved to a beneficial owner after she broke the third intermediary layer, a man named Paul Gentry, director of subsidiary operations at Moretti Capital, 11 years with the company, access to all 6 affected subsidiaries, deep operational knowledge of the audit schedule because he'd helped design it. She called Luca from her office at 3 in the afternoon. Paul Gentry, she said. The silence lasted 4 seconds. You're certain. The beneficial ownership documentation is clean. The transfer authorizations are traceable back to his credentials. I have enough for a federal referral and enough for any civil action you want to pursue. She paused. Do you want me to walk you through the full evidence package today? Yes. Another pause. Not on the phone. My office or yours? Mine, he said. 6 o'clock. The 52nd floor at 6 in the evening was different from the 52nd floor at 2 in the afternoon. The support staff was gone. The conference room where they'd first met was dark. Claire Weston was still there. She was always still there, Vivian had come to understand. And Dominic Reyes, and a third man she hadn't met before, who was introduced simply as Vincent, and whose specific role was not explained and whom Vivian did not ask about. She laid out the complete evidence package. She walked them through every step of the attribution chain, answered every question, addressed every challenge that Claire raised with the professional efficiency of someone who had built the case to withstand challenge. When she finished, Luca looked at the documents for a moment. Gentry's been with me 11 years, he said. Yes. He has a family. She waited. I know, he said, not to her, to himself or to the room. Then back to her. You said federal referral. What does that timeline look like? If you bring this to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, and I can facilitate that introduction, they'll open a formal investigation. Given the documentation quality, it moves relatively quickly. Gentry would be looking at federal wire fraud, money laundering charges depending on where the diverted funds ended up. She met his eyes. That's the clean path. The room was very quiet. And the other paths? Vincent said. It was the first thing he'd said. Vivian looked at him directly. I only work on the clean path. Luca's eyes moved between her and Vincent, and something passed through the room that she felt without being able to name. A recalibration of some kind, a hierarchy reasserting itself. The federal referral, Luca said. Draw up the documentation for submission. I want to review it before it goes anywhere. I'll have it ready by end of next week. Monday, he said. Wednesday, she said. Done right. He almost smiled. Wednesday. She gathered her documents and Claire showed her out. And in the elevator, Vivian pressed lobby and stood with her briefcase and understood that something had shifted in the last 2 hours that had nothing to do with Paul Gentry or Meridian Pacific or the evidence she had just presented. The way he'd said he has a family. The weight of it. Not the remark of a man calculating exposure. The remark of a man who was tired of what his world required of him. She knew what she'd heard. She told herself she was misreading it. Wednesday arrived. She delivered the federal referral documentation. He reviewed it at his desk while she sat across from him. Not in the conference room this time, in his actual office, the corner one with the floor-to-ceiling windows, and the city spread out like a proposition. And she watched him read with the focused quiet of someone who processed information completely before responding. He asked 3 questions. She answered all 3. He signed the authorization for submission. "This is the right thing," she said, not reassuring him, stating a fact. "I know." He set the pen down. He looked at her. "You want to ask me something?" She did. She'd been not asking it for 2 weeks. What Gentry did with the money, whether you know where it went. "I have an idea." A pause. "It doesn't change the referral." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." "He was leveraged," Luca said. "Someone used something against him to get access to my operation. The money was secondary." He looked at the window. Someone was buying information, not just capital. The audit suddenly felt smaller than it had an hour ago. "You knew this before you hired me." "I suspected it." He looked back at her. "I needed proof I could use. And now you have it. And now I have it." His voice was level, but she heard the thing underneath. The anger contained, compressed into something dense and quiet. The kind of anger that had been living in a person long enough to become structural. "Who leveraged him?" she said. "That's the next problem." He held her gaze. "Not one I'm asking you to solve." She understood that. She also understood that she was now aware of it, which put her in a different position than she'd been in an hour ago. She was no longer just an investigator completing an engagement. She was someone who knew that the audit she'd conducted was the visible surface of something larger, something that had moving parts she couldn't see and didn't have authorization to look at. That was the kind of knowledge that changed your exposure. She knew that. He knew that she knew it. "The engagement is technically complete," she said. "Technically. My report is delivered. The federal referral is authorized." She held his gaze. "I could walk out of here and we could call it finished." He said nothing. "But whoever leveraged Gentry," she said slowly, "used the same access protocols I've been working with for 6 weeks. If they were watching the audit, they were. Then they know what I found." She let that sit for a moment. "And they know I can find more." Yes, the city was everywhere outside the windows. 52 floors of it below them, and beyond that the harbor, and beyond that the world that didn't know any of this was happening. She looked at the desk between them. The signed authorization, her documents, the ordered evidence of a thing that had taken her 6 weeks to build. "What are you asking me?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Not yet." He picked up the authorization. "Go home, Vivian. Get some sleep. The referral goes in tomorrow morning." It was the first time he'd used her first name. Not Ms. Mercer, not the professional designation that kept everything correctly bounded and labeled and safe. Her name, in his voice, in the corner office with the city spread out below them and the federal referral between them and the knowledge of something larger neither of them had named aloud yet. She picked up her briefcase. She stood. She made it to the door. "Vivian." She stopped, didn't turn. "Thank you," he said. "For Wednesday. For all of it." She nodded without looking back and walked out, and in the elevator she pressed lobby and stood very still while the floors counted down. And by the time she reached the street, she had almost convinced herself that the way her name sounded in his mouth meant nothing beyond professional courtesy. Almost. 3 days after the federal referral was submitted, Paul Gentry disappeared. Not fled, disappeared. His car was in his driveway. His phone went to voicemail after 1 ring. His wife called the police at 9 in the morning when he didn't come down for breakfast. And by noon there were 2 detectives in the Moretti Capitol lobby asking for Luca. Vivian got the call from Claire Weston at 1:15. "The detectives are asking about the referral," Claire said. Her voice was its usual precise professional instrument, but something underneath it was running fast. They know the submission happened. They want to talk to the investigator of record. Vivian was at her desk. She set down her pen very deliberately. Tell them I'll come in this afternoon. She arrived at Moretti Capital at 3. The two detectives, a woman named Reyes, who was not related to Dominic, a man named Carr, who asked most of the questions, interviewed her in the conference room where she'd first met Luca, which had a quality of dark symmetry, she noted, and set aside. She answered what she could answer. She was the independent forensic investigator. She had conducted an audit. She had found evidence of financial misconduct. She had prepared a federal referral at her client's direction. Everything she said was true, documented, and professionally defensible. What she didn't say was what Luca had told her, about the leverage, about someone buying access to his operation, about the layer beneath the layer. When the detectives left, she found Luca in his office. He was standing at the window, not looking at anything specific, just standing, the way a person stands when they're holding something that has too much weight. "Did they tell you anything?" she said. "They found evidence he was planning to leave the country. Passport, some cash, a bag." He paused. "Whoever took him moved fast, before he could." Fast meaning they knew about the referral. Fast meaning someone in the federal system told them the referral was coming. His voice was very flat. "Which means whoever is behind this has reach I underestimated." The room felt different than it had 3 days ago. The authorization on the desk, signed and submitted, now felt like a tripwire she hadn't seen. "You told me," she said, "that whoever leveraged Gentry was buying information, not just capital." "Yes." "Information about your operation." "Yes." She looked at him. "They were building a case against you." He turned from the window. "Yes." "And you submitted the federal referral knowing that." "I submitted the federal referral because it was the right thing to do." His eyes were direct, hard, and absolutely certain. "And because whoever is doing this needs to know I'm not going to manage it quietly. Luca." She hadn't meant to use his name. It came out anyway. "If they have reach inside the federal system, if they knew about the referral before Gentry could be questioned, then we have a problem." "We," she said. He held her gaze. "You're the investigator of record. You built the case." "Yes, we." She stood in his office on the 52nd floor with the city below and the understanding that she had moved, somewhere in the last 6 weeks, from the clean side of an audit engagement into something she didn't have a professional category for. And the man responsible for that movement was standing 10 feet away looking at her like she was the only person in the room whose opinion he had actually wanted. "I need to know everything," she said. "Not the version you give clients and lawyers. Everything." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Sit down." And she did. And he began to talk, really talk, the way he'd played piano in the Whitmore music room, without the armor, without the construction, with the particular rawness of someone who had been carrying something alone for long enough that the weight had become its own kind of damage. And Vivian sat across from him in the corner office with the city spread below and listened to the whole truth for the first time, and understood, with the cold clarity she'd spent 15 years building, that she had just crossed a line she could not uncross. That the next step was not professional, was not bounded by an engagement agreement or a conflict of interest protocol or any of the structures she had built her life inside of. That whatever came next, she was in it. And somewhere beneath the fear and the professional alarm and the very reasonable part of her that was already calculating exit strategies, somewhere beneath all of that, quiet and dangerous and real, she didn't want out. He talked for 2 hours. Vivian didn't move from the chair across from his desk. She didn't take notes. She had learned years ago that note-taking in certain conversations changed what people were willing to say, and she needed him to say all of it. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, and her breathing even, and her face giving nothing back. The way she sat through depositions, through confrontational client meetings, through the worst moments of the worst cases she'd ever worked. He told her about the organization that had been applying pressure to his operation for 14 months. Not a rival family. Something more structured than that. More institutional, with reach inside law enforcement and the federal financial system that suggested resources and connections assembled over years, not improvised. He called them the Vanek Network, after the man he believed was at its center, a name she didn't recognize, which meant he was either very careful or very new, and neither option was comforting. He told her that Gentry had been approached 8 months ago, that the approach had been sophisticated, not a threat, initially. A business conversation, Gentry had called it, when Luca's people had quietly begun reconstructing the sequence of events. Someone had presented Gentry with a detailed accounting of certain decisions he'd made in his personal financial life. Not criminal decisions, just bad ones. The kind every person made when they were stretched too thin and trying not to show it. A second mortgage. A private loan from a source that turned out to have conditions attached. The kind of situation that looked manageable until someone with the right information decided to make it unmanageable. They didn't threaten his family, Luca said. They didn't need to. They just explained to him very clearly what his options were. And his options were cooperate or financial destruction. Financial destruction followed by criminal referral for the loan violations. They had enough to ruin him without touching anything related to me. He paused. He made a choice. He made the only choice they left him. Yes. His voice was flat. I know. She looked at him. You don't blame him. I blame the people who put him in that position. He said it without heat, which made it worse somehow. The anger that had moved past the stage of needing to be loud. Gentry was a mechanism. The people who built the mechanism are the problem. And now Gentry is gone. And now whoever took him either has him talking already or has made sure he can't. His jaw tightened. Either way, the referral I submitted just became a liability. Because if Gentry was the Vanek Network's mechanism inside your operation, and they removed him before he could be questioned, then the federal investigation I triggered looks like I was trying to control the narrative, not expose misconduct. He met her eyes. It looks like I knew what Gentry was doing and submitted the referral as a preemptive move to protect myself. The logic of it settled into the room like something heavy and cold. Who would construct that interpretation? She said. Someone with reach inside the investigation. Someone who can steer the inquiry. He looked at the window. I told you the referral went into a system that someone else can see. Yes. That someone is now deciding what the investigation finds. She sat with that. The audit she had built, 6 weeks of careful, methodical, legally defensible work, had just been converted into a tool against the man who'd commissioned it. The evidence she'd assembled was real. The federal referral was correctly prepared. None of that mattered if the interpretation of it was controlled by someone with sufficient institutional reach. I need to know, she said carefully, whether any of what I found in the audit has direct connections to criminal operations, beyond Meridian Pacific, beyond the legitimate portfolio. He looked at her for a long moment. Why? Because if it does, and the investigation widens, my work becomes part of a criminal case rather than a financial misconduct case. That changes my exposure and my obligations. Your obligations, he said, not mocking, just registering the word. I'm an investigator. I have legal reporting requirements. If I have material knowledge of... Stop. He said it quietly, without force, but she stopped. He leaned forward, elbows on the desk, and looked at her directly. Nothing in the audit connects to anything outside the legitimate portfolio. That's the truth. What exists outside the legitimate portfolio is not in your audit, and you have not been made aware of it. A pause. I am making a choice right now about what you know. Do you understand what I'm telling you? She understood exactly what he was telling her. He was drawing a line for her benefit, on purpose, at cost to himself. Because the information on the other side of that line would complicate her position in ways she might not be able to manage professionally. Yes, she said, I understand. Good. He sat back. Then what you know is this. A forensic audit revealed misconduct. The responsible party has disappeared under suspicious circumstances. The federal referral is now caught inside a process that may be compromised. He held her gaze. That's a complete and accurate account of your professional involvement. And the rest? The rest is mine to carry. She sat for a moment. Then she said, What are you going to do? Find Paul Gentry, he said, before anyone else does. She left at 8:30. The city was doing its evening thing. The dinner crowd on the sidewalks, the cab horns, the particular ambient light of Manhattan in autumn that turned everything amber and provisional. She walked 6 blocks before she got into a cab, and she sat in the back seat looking at the city moving past and thinking about the line he'd drawn and the choice he'd made in drawing it. He had protected her, deliberately, explicitly, at the cost of her knowing less than she could have known. That was not what dangerous men did. That was not the move of someone running a calculation about her usefulness. She thought about that the whole way home, and she thought about it standing in her kitchen at 9:15 eating cold takeout she'd pulled from the refrigerator without tasting it, and she thought about it for a long time before she slept. The call came at 6:47 in the morning. She was already up. She'd been awake since 5, which was becoming normal, the audit's residual energy refusing to release her into sleep past 4:30 or 5. She was at her kitchen table with coffee and her laptop when her phone rang, and the number on the screen was not one she recognized. She answered. "Ms. Mercer." A man's voice, smooth, unhurried, with a faint accent she couldn't immediately place. Eastern European, maybe, or somewhere in that geographic corridor. "I hope I'm not calling too early." "Who is this?" "My name isn't important right now. What's important is that we have a mutual interest in the Meridian Pacific matter." A pause. "And that you're in a position that's about to become significantly more uncomfortable if you don't make some intelligent choices in the next 48 hours. Her hand tightened on the phone. She stood up from the table, moved to the window. The street below was gray morning, early commuters, a delivery truck blocking the bike lane. Normal city things. She focused on them. "What mutual interest?" "You built a very clean evidentiary package," the voice said. "We've had an opportunity to review it. Impressive work. The attribution methodology in particular was elegant." A pause that felt deliberate. "We'd like to discuss an arrangement." "I don't make arrangements with people who call me anonymously at 6:47 in the morning." "You will want to make an exception." No threat in the voice. Something worse. Absolute certainty. "Because the alternative involves you being named as a material witness in a federal investigation that is going to go in a direction you haven't anticipated." She said nothing. Her breathing was careful. "Mr. Moretti's operation has been under federal scrutiny for considerably longer than the Meridian Pacific audit," the voice continued. "Your engagement places you inside that scrutiny. The question is whether you're a cooperating professional who assisted in identifying misconduct, or whether you're someone whose 6-week engagement at Moretti Capital raises questions about the nature of your involvement." "My engagement is documented and legally clean." "Your engagement is documented," the voice agreed. "Whether it reads as clean depends entirely on who's writing the report." Another pause. "We can ensure it reads correctly, or we can allow it to develop on its own, which I promise you will not be pleasant." "What do you want?" "A conversation, in person, today." He gave her an address, a midtown hotel, one of the anonymous business ones, a conference room reserved under a corporate name. Noon. He ended the call before she could respond. She stood at the window for a full minute, the phone in her hand, looking at the delivery truck that had finally moved and the bike lane now empty, and the morning assembling itself into a normal day that was not going to be normal. Then she called Luca. He arrived at her apartment in 35 minutes. She had not invited him to her apartment before. She had given him the address in the call because it was faster than getting to his office. And she had not thought about the implications of that until he was standing at her door and she was letting him in. He looked at her face and didn't say anything about the apartment. He came in, sat at her kitchen table, and listened while she played him the recording. She had recorded the call the moment she recognized what it was. 15 years of forensic work had made the reflex automatic. He listened to the whole thing without expression. When it ended, he sat with his hands flat on the table and breathed through his nose, and she watched the controlled anger do what it did: compress, densify, become something structural. "Vanek," he said. "You recognize the voice?" "No, but the methodology." He looked up at her. "This is how they operate. Clean the target first, then offer the alternative. They did the same thing to Gentry." His jaw was tight. "You don't go. I know I don't go. I mean, you don't go. You don't respond. You don't acknowledge the contact. You let me handle this." She looked at him. "How?" "I know where to apply pressure. On a network that has reach inside the federal financial system." She kept her voice even. "Luca, if you move on them directly right now, after Gentry, after the referral, if I don't move, they take you apart." The words came out flat and very certain. That's what this call was. It wasn't a negotiation. It was them telling you that you're exposed so that you either cooperate with them or you go back to me and I make a move they can use. She sat down across from him. "You think this call was designed to make you react?" Yes. Then we don't react. Vivian, we don't react, she said again, more firmly. We think. We find another path. She held his gaze. I did not spend 6 weeks building a clean evidentiary case to watch it weaponized because we panicked. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his face. Not quite concession, but close to it. The particular expression of a man who is used to being the one with the plan, encountering someone else's certainty, and finding it, against his expectation, solid. All right, he said. Then what's the path? I need everything you have on the Vanek network. Everything. Not the protected version. She held his gaze. I know you drew a line last night. I'm asking you to move it. The information he gave her over the next 4 hours rewrote the architecture of everything she thought she understood about the case. Vanek, whose actual name was Theodor Vanek, Czech national, resident of record in Vienna, holding companies in 6 jurisdictions, had been assembling leverage against high-net-worth criminal operations in the northeastern United States for 7 years, not to destroy them, to absorb them. He didn't want to eliminate competitors. He wanted to own them, convert their operations into subsidiaries of his own network, use their existing infrastructure and relationships while removing the people at the top and replacing them with figures who answered to him. Gentry had been providing structural intelligence, not just financial data, but the operational map of how Moretti's organization actually functioned, where the decision nodes were, who the key relationships were. The financial diversion was secondary. It was meant to create a crisis that would destabilize the operation at the right moment. The federal angle was Vanek's insurance. He had a contact inside the northeastern field office of the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, not someone senior, a mid-level analyst who processed referrals and had access to case assignment data. Enough to steer an investigation's early direction, enough to ensure that the Meridian Pacific referral, once submitted, got assigned to an agent who would approach it with a specific interpretive framework already in place. The agent's name, Vivian said. Luca hesitated. Give me the name. Daniel Frost. He watched her face. You know him. She did. She knew Daniel Frost the way you knew people in overlapping professional worlds. Not well, not personally, but well enough to have formed an assessment. Smart, methodical. Had a reputation for aggressive case development. She had crossed paths with him twice in deposition contexts. Frost isn't dirty, she said. Certain. No, he's being managed without knowing it. The analyst feeds him a framing. He develops the case within that frame without questioning where the frame came from. Luca's voice was measured. Frost is a good investigator being used as a tool. Which means if Frost sees the actual evidence, he'll follow it, yes. Luca looked at her. But getting the actual evidence in front of him unmediated means going around the analyst, which means someone has to walk into that field office and hand Frost a complete counter-narrative with documentation. That would have to be someone he'd listen to. Yes. She looked at the material spread across her kitchen table, the 6 weeks of work, the attribution documentation. And now this, the layer beneath, the architecture of what Vanek had actually built, the intelligence that reframed the entire Meridian Pacific situation from financial misconduct into something considerably larger. If I go to Frost directly, she said slowly, without going through official channels, I'm bypassing the submission protocol. That's a professional exposure. Yes, and if the analyst is monitoring the case and sees me approach Frost directly, that tips Vanek that we know about the inside connection. Yes. So the window is narrow. She looked at him. It would have to be a single contact, one meeting, complete documentation, no advance notice. He nodded. And after that meeting, she said, whatever Frost does with it, we have no control. No. She sat back. She looked at her kitchen, the ordinary Tuesday morning kitchen with the coffee cups and the laptop, and the delivery menus on the counter that she never sorted through, and the plant on the windowsill that was alive mainly through luck. The apartment she had lived in for 6 years that felt suddenly like it belonged to someone slightly different from the person sitting in it now. There's something else, Luca said. His voice had changed, enough that she looked at him directly. The reason I hired you. He held her gaze and his eyes were very direct and very still. The Callaway audit. The methodology. The reputation. Yes. All of that was true, he said. But it wasn't. He stopped, set his hands flat on the table. The engagement was legitimate. Meridian Pacific needed a proper audit, and you were the right person for it. All of that is true. A pause. It's also true that I arranged for the introduction to happen. She went very still. Your cousin's engagement party, he said. The Whitmore connection. I've known Preston Whitmore for 4 years. I knew Darcy Mercer was your cousin. I knew you'd be at that party. He didn't look away. The corridor, running into you, that was... He stopped again. Something in his face that she had never seen before, not guilt, exactly. Something raw. I positioned myself. The kitchen was very quiet. She heard the refrigerator hum, the distant sound of the street below, her own breathing. The audit invitation, she said. Her voice came out flat. You already knew who I was. Yes. You engineered the circumstances. Each word came out separately, with the particular precision of someone controlling a response that wants to be something much louder. The party, the corridor, the professional invitation. You built the sequence. The feelings that developed were not engineered, he said. I want you to understand that. Don't. The word came out hard. Don't explain the feelings right now. He closed his mouth. She stood up. She needed to not be sitting across from him. She moved to the counter, put her back to it, looked at the table and the documents and the man who had just dismantled the architecture of the last 6 weeks with one admission. The audit was real, he said. The misconduct was real. Everything you found was there to be found. I didn't fabricate. I know you didn't fabricate it. Her voice was tight. That's not the point. Then what's the point? She looked at him. The point is that I walked into your orbit believing it was my professional choice, my assessment of the engagement, my decision to accept, my judgment about the client. She pressed her hands flat against the counter behind her. You removed my ability to choose freely. You made the circumstances and then put me in them and let me believe I was choosing. His jaw tightened. Yes. That is the one thing, she said, the one thing I do not forgive in people. The room held that. He didn't try to argue it. He didn't offer another explanation. He sat at her kitchen table with his hands flat on the surface and took it, which was its own kind of answer. A man who understood he had done something wrong and was not going to perform his way out of it. It didn't make her less furious. It made her more. Get out, she said. Vivian, I need you to leave my apartment. Her voice was level, completely level, which cost her something. I will handle Daniel Frost. I will take the counter-narrative to him directly, because that is still the right thing to do, and you didn't contaminate the evidence by engineering my recruitment. The work stands. She met his eyes. But I need you to leave. He stood. He gathered nothing. He'd brought nothing. He walked to her apartment door and she did not move from the counter. At the door he stopped. I was wrong, he said. Not qualified. Not followed by justification. Just that. Yes, she said. You were. He left. She stood at the counter in her kitchen for a long time after the door closed, and she did not move, and she did not make another cup of coffee, and she did not look at the documents on the table. And somewhere in the middle of that stillness, she understood that the fury she was feeling was not clean. Clean fury was simple. Clean fury burned and cleared. This had something else in it. Something that made the fury worse, because underneath it, complicated and unwanted and completely without professional sanction, was the knowledge that a man who controlled everything had chosen her freely, had wanted her specifically, had done something wrong in the service of something real. That knowledge didn't excuse it, but it lived in her anyway, right next to the rage, and she hated that it did. She picked up her phone. She called the number she had for Daniel Frost's direct line, the one from the deposition 2 years ago that she'd never deleted. And when it went to voicemail, she said, "This is Vivian Mercer. I have material evidence related to a case you've recently been assigned. I need 30 minutes of your time today. This is time sensitive and cannot go through standard intake." She left her number. "Please call me back." She hung up. She looked at the window and the gray October morning outside it, and the plant on the sill that was surviving mainly through. Frost called back in 40 minutes. She was still at the counter when the phone rang, the documents still spread across her kitchen table, the plant still alive on the windowsill by whatever force kept neglected things alive. She answered before the second ring. "Miss Mercer." Frost's voice was what she remembered, measured, professionally neutral, the voice of a man who had learned to give nothing away on the phone because phones were not secure. "I got your message. Thank you for calling back quickly. You said time sensitive. It is." She moved to the table, sat down, pulled the core documents toward her. "The Meridian Pacific referral that came across your desk recently. I'm the investigator of record." A pause, short but real. "I'm aware of who you are." "Then you know my work is clean." "I know your reputation." Careful. "What do you have?" "Evidence that the referral is being used as a mechanism inside a larger operation targeting the submitting party. Evidence that includes a compromised access point inside your field office." She let that sit for exactly 2 seconds. "I need 30 minutes. In person. No advance notice to anyone inside your chain." The silence this time was longer. She counted it. 4 seconds. 5. Frost was smart. He was processing what she'd just implied about his own house and deciding whether she was credible or whether this was itself a manipulation. "My office," he said. 2 o'clock. "Somewhere neutral," she said. "Not your building." Another pause. "There's a federal courthouse annex on Worth Street. 3rd floor, conference room C. Public building, security on entry, no advance reservation required." A beat. 2 o'clock. "I'll be there." She hung up and sat for a moment with her hands on the documents. Then she started organizing them, building the presentation package, the sequence that told the story most efficiently for an investigator who would be skeptical, who would be looking for the angle, who would need the evidence to be undeniable before he shifted his interpretive frame. She worked for 3 hours. She did not think about Luca. She thought about him only in the way that you think about a bruise. Not directly, but aware of it. The peripheral consciousness of something that hurt when you moved wrong. She did not call him to tell him about Frost. She understood why she should. She called Marcus instead, told him what she needed printed and bound and ready, and Marcus, who had learned in 2 years of working with her not to ask questions before the answer was available, said he'd have it ready by noon. She went to the office. She picked up the package. She got in a cab and went to Worth Street and went through security and found conference room C on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled of fluorescent lights and institutional carpet and the low-grade tension of legal proceedings. Frost was already there, though he was younger than she remembered, mid-40s maybe, with the kind of face that had been handsome before a decade of federal law enforcement had reorganized it into something more functional. He was in a suit that was good but not expensive, which told her things about how he understood his role. He stood when she came in, which told her other things. "Ms. Mercer." He shook her hand. His grip was brief, professional. "Sit down." She sat. She put the package on the table between them. "Before I open that," he said, "I want to be direct with you. This meeting is irregular. You requested it in a way that implied a compromise inside my office, which is an allegation I take seriously. It is also an allegation that, if false or manipulated, puts you in a very difficult position." His eyes were steady. "I need to understand your interest here." "My interest is that I built a clean case and it's being used against the person who hired me to build it. My professional integrity is attached to that case. If it's steered toward a false conclusion, my name is on the wrong side of it." She held his gaze. "That's my interest." "Your client is Luca Moretti." "My client was Meridian Pacific Holdings, a legitimate investment portfolio owned by Luca Moretti, whose legitimate business operations were the subject of my engagement." She kept her voice even. "What exists outside those legitimate operations is not in my audit, and I am not speaking to it." Frost looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Open the package." She opened it. She walked him through it the way she'd walked Luca through the original audit. Methodical, sequenced, building the foundation before the conclusion. She showed him the Vanek network documentation. She showed him the Gentry leverage sequence. She showed him the evidence of the mid-level analyst access. She had the analyst's name from the information Luca had given her, and she had traced the analyst's case assignment history and found a pattern of steering that was not provable beyond reasonable doubt but was consistent and directional. She did not tell Frost where the intelligence on the analyst had come from. That was the line she'd chosen. The evidence she presented was verifiable independently. The source of her knowledge about what to look for was not his business. Frost was very quiet through all of it. He didn't interrupt. He looked at documents when she indicated them, set them down, looked at the next ones. His face moved only slightly, a tightening around the eyes when she showed him the analyst's pattern, a very small controlled reaction that told her his professional instincts were firing. When she finished, he sat back. This analyst, you're not naming him as dirty. No. The evidence suggests he's being managed, fed a framework without understanding the source. She paused. Like most good investigators who get used as tools. The implication landed. His jaw tightened. If this is accurate, it's accurate. You can verify every component independently. Then the investigation has been compromised from intake. He said it quietly, with the particular weight of a man whose house he'd believed clean, discovering a crack in the foundation. The referral itself is valid. The misconduct in the Meridian Pacific audit is real and documented. The person who committed it is missing, which is a separate problem. She held his gaze. The case can be rebuilt on the actual evidence, but it has to come from you, directly, without the analyst in the chain. You're telling me how to run my investigation. I'm telling you what I found. What you do with it is yours. He looked at the package on the table. He looked at her. Why come to me directly? Why not go through official channels, file a complaint about the analyst because official channels feed through the same intake process, and because time-sensitive in my message meant what it said. She paused. Vanek knows the referral was submitted. He's moved on Gentry. His next move is to accelerate whatever the analyst has been building, because once the investigation officially develops past a certain point, the narrative becomes much harder to correct. How do you know his timeline? She held the pause for exactly the right length. I know investigative timelines. That's what I do. Frost looked at her for a long moment. She could see him running the decision, the weight of what she'd presented against the professional risk of acting on it, the credibility calculus, the awareness that she could be a manipulation, and the awareness that if she wasn't, the cost of inaction was worse. I'm going to need 48 hours to independently verify the core elements, he said. You have 36, she said. After that, it's going to move without you. He held her gaze. Then he nodded. One motion, the decision made and visible in it. I'll be in touch. She left the package with him. She walked out of the conference room and down the corridor and through security and out onto Worth Street and into the October air, and she stood on the sidewalk for a moment with the city moving around her and understood that she had just done everything she could do. The rest was Frost's, and whatever Luca was moving on his end. She took the subway back uptown and did not call Luca. She made it 4 hours. It was his number on her screen at 7:15. She stared at it for 2 rings. Answered. Are you all right? He said. Yes. The word came out shorter than she intended. Frost called me. A pause. He wanted to verify one element of the documentation independently. He called Claire. She absorbed that. What did Claire tell him? The truth, which is the only thing Claire tells anyone. His voice was controlled. Vivian, I owe you. Don't. She sat down on her couch. She was tired. The particular bone tiredness that came after high concentration work and emotional violence in the same day. Not tonight. Silence. Then, are you safe? Yes. Ivanik's people... Luca. She said his name and it came out with too much in it. The fury and the exhaustion and the other things she hadn't given a name to yet. I'm safe. I'm home. Let me think. All right. A pause. All right. He ended the call. She sat on her couch and looked at her apartment and understood that she was angrier than she'd let herself feel fully yet, and that the anger was going to have to wait because somewhere in the next 36 hours, everything was either going to resolve or fracture completely, and she needed to be functional for whichever it was. She set an alarm for 5:30 and lay down in her clothes and slept 3 hours, which was enough. The next morning moved in 2-hour increments. She was at her desk by 6. Marcus came in at 8, and she gave him cleanup work on the documentation. Nothing he needed context for, just verification and formatting. She told him nothing else. At 10:14, her phone rang. Unknown number. She knew before she answered. You made a mistake, the voice said. The same voice from the 647 call, smooth, unhurried, but something in it now that hadn't been there before. A tightness under the control, a man whose certainty had developed a hairline crack. Good morning, she said. You went to Frost directly. That was foolish. A pause. He's not going to be able to help you on the timeline you think. The documentation you gave him requires verification that will take longer than... You're calling me, she said, because something is happening faster than you expected. If you had control of the timeline, you wouldn't be calling. Silence. 3 seconds. 4. Ms. Mercer. The smoothness came back, but thinner now, like paint over something rough. There is a version of this that ends well for you. You walk away from Moretti, you submit an amended professional statement indicating your audit conclusions were preliminary and require further review, and you have no further exposure to... I'm going to stop you there, she said. My audit conclusions are not preliminary, and I don't amend my work to suit someone else's narrative. If you call me again, I'll add the recording of this conversation to the package that's currently in Daniel Frost's hands. She paused. Goodbye. She hung up. Her hands were steady. She registered that with a kind of distant professional satisfaction, the specific solidity that came when you'd committed completely to a direction and the fear had burned off and left something cleaner behind. She called Luca. They called me, she said when he answered. Vonneck's people. They're losing the timeline. I know. His voice was different, tighter, faster. Vincent located Gentry this morning. She stood up. Is he alive? Yes. They had him in a house in Queens. Vincent's team moved 2 hours ago. A pause, and she heard something in the background. Movement, voices. Gentry is talking. He's been talking since 6 this morning. Vincent has it on record. That record needs to go to Frost directly, not through intake. I know, I need you to make that call. His voice was urgent but controlled. Frost will take it from you, if it comes from my side. It looks like I'm managing the investigation. Yes. She was already moving, picking up her jacket. Send me everything Vincent has. Full recording, chain of custody documentation, anything Gentry said about the analyst by name. Sending now. Luca. She stopped. Gentry is going to need protection. Federal protection. I know. You can't be the one to provide it. A pause. I know. Frost can arrange it if I... Vivian. His voice dropped, just slightly. I know. Do what you need to do. I trust your judgment. The 3 words landed in the middle of everything else, the urgency and the fear and the fury she was still carrying, and sat there with a weight that was completely out of proportion to their size. She hung up and read Gentry's testimony on her phone while hailing a cab. It was worse than she'd expected, and it was exactly what Frost needed. She called Frost from the cab. He answered on the first ring. I have Paul Gentry's recorded testimony, she said. He names the analyst. He names the contact point inside the Vanek network. He describes the mechanism in detail. She paused. He's alive and in a secure location. He's prepared to come in voluntarily. The silence on Frost's end had a quality she recognized, the sound of a decision that had already been made clicking into its final position. Where is Ibata? I can get you a location in the next 30 minutes. But I need your word that intake goes directly to you. Nothing through standard processing. You have it. And Frost. She looked out the cab window at the city moving past. The analyst. Handle it quietly. He's not the problem, he was a mechanism. The same as Gentry. Understood. A pause. Miss Mercer, this is... He stopped, started again. You did good work. I know, she said. Not arrogance, just the clean statement of fact she had earned. I'll send the location in 30 minutes. She hung up. She texted Vincent's number, Luca had sent it, and got the Queen's address in 40 seconds. She forwarded it to Frost with a 3-line message and sat back in the cab and watched the city and breathed. The cab driver had the radio on low. Traffic report. Normal Tuesday. The city had no idea. The next 12 hours moved the way crisis resolution always moved, in bursts and then in waiting, adrenaline, and then the particular exhaustion of sustained tension without physical release. Gentry went in at 2 in the afternoon, Frost's direct escort, no standard intake. The analyst was removed from the case by 4, quietly, reassigned, the action documented internally in language that didn't yet reach official record, but would. The Vanek network's contact inside the federal system was severed, a clean cut, the kind that didn't announce itself. Vivian knew all of this because Frost called her twice, and because Claire Weston texted her updates in the precise, verb-less style Claire used for everything, and because the particular silence from the Vanek-associated number that had called her at 6:47 told its own story. She was at her desk at 8 in the evening, the office empty again, the Hendricks brief still open on her second screen as a reminder that the world outside this case continued to require her attention when her phone showed Luca's name. She looked at it. She let it ring 3 times. She answered. "It's moving the right direction," he said. "Yes." "Frost is good." "Yes." She paused. "How's Vincent?" "Fine. He's dealt with worse than Queens on a Tuesday." Something in his voice, not lightness exactly, but the release valve of pressure, finding a small exit. "Vivian, I want to—" "I know." She cut it off, not unkindly. "Not over the phone." "When?" It wasn't a question about logistics. She understood that. She sat at her desk with the city outside her window and the Hendricks brief on her screen, and the last 6 weeks assembled behind her like a structure she'd built without a blueprint, and she said, "I don't know yet." "All right." "Luca." She pressed her hand flat on the desk. "What you told me this morning, the party, the corridor, engineering the circumstances." "Yes." "Did you know what would happen when you positioned yourself?" Her voice was careful. "Did you know it would become—" She stopped, chose the word. "This," a long pause, longer than his usual pauses, the controlled ones. "No," he said. "I knew I wanted to meet you. I knew the professional engagement was real and justified. I knew I had reasons for wanting you specifically on the audit." A pause. "I didn't know I'd be sitting in your kitchen at 7 in the morning, feeling like I'd swallowed something I couldn't name." His voice was very quiet. "I didn't plan for that part." She sat with that. "I have to go," she said. "I know." She ended the call and sat in her empty office for a long time, and the city outside was doing what it always did. Indifferent, enormous, lit against the dark. And she was sitting inside it with the particular feeling of someone who has survived something and not yet decided what to do with the survival. Frost called at 9:47. "We have enough to open a formal investigation into the Vanek network," he said. "Independent of the Meridian Pacific case, Gentry's testimony is clean and corroborated by the financial documentation you provided." A pause. "The Meridian Pacific referral stands as submitted. The case is being reassigned and the previous framing is being reviewed." He paused again. "Your audit is the foundation." "I know it is. Your professional exposure from this engagement is—" He seemed to be choosing words. "Clean. The record will reflect that you identified a compromise process and took appropriate action." "Thank you, Frost." "Thank you, Ms. Mercer." He ended the call without ceremony, which she respected. She sat for a moment. Then she packed her briefcase, turned off her screens, locked her office, rode the elevator down 14 floors, and walked out into the October night. The air was cold. Real cold now. The turning point cold of autumn becoming something more serious. She stood on the sidewalk and breathed it and looked at the street and the cabs and the people moving past with their shoulders up and their faces down against the chill. Her phone buzzed. A text from Luca, 4 words. "Are you all right?" Not a question. The period was deliberate. She'd noticed he did that, turned questions into statements when he wasn't sure he had the right to ask them. She looked at the text for a moment. Then she typed back 2 words and sent it, and put her phone in her pocket and started walking toward the subway. She had typed, "Not yet." And then, after a beat, a second text. But working on it. She walked 6 blocks before she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she was working on. The anger, still real, not resolved, not erased by a good outcome. The knowledge of what he'd done, clear-eyed, permanent. And alongside it, just as permanent, the other knowledge. That a man who had controlled everything had found one thing he couldn't control and had responded to that by making choices. She had watched him make, one after another, that cost him something real. The anger and the other thing were both true simultaneously. She was a person who dealt in evidence. Both things were in the record. She couldn't ignore one to make the other cleaner. She got on the train and rode it uptown with the car's particular noise around her, the tunnel dark outside the windows, the other passengers with their own lives and their own weight, and somewhere under the clatter of the wheels on the tracks, she began, very quietly, to work out what came next. She didn't see him for 11 days. She finished the Hendricks brief. She invoiced for the Meridian Pacific engagement, the full amount, no adjustment, because the work had been done and done correctly, and she didn't punish her professional standards for her personal complications. She got a call from a corporate client in Boston who needed a forensic review of an acquisition target, and she agreed to take it. She ran. 4 mornings a week, the park loop, in the real cold now, her breath making small clouds ahead of her, her feet finding the rhythm that cleared everything to baseline. She did not call him. He did not call her. He texted twice, once to tell her the Frost investigation had formally opened, the Vanek network now a federal matter with its own case number and its own team, once to tell her that Gentry had entered a cooperation agreement and was in protective housing with his family. She read both texts and did not respond and told herself this was the right pace, that she was not ready. On the 11th day, she came out of her building at 6:40 in the morning for the park loop and found a car parked at the curb that was not a cab and not a delivery vehicle, and standing beside it, in the cold, in a coat that was not adequate for the temperature he'd apparently been standing in for some time, was Luca Moretti. He looked tired. Not the controlled tiredness of a man who'd managed his rest carefully. Genuinely tired. The deep register kind. The kind that lived in the face after days of accumulated weight. He was holding 2 cups from the Greek diner. He held one out. She stopped on the sidewalk 3 feet from him. She looked at the coffee. She looked at him. "You're going to freeze," she said. "I've been here 20 minutes," he said. "I'm aware." She took the coffee. The cup was warm in her hands. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the street was quiet at 6:40 in the morning, with the cold turning their breath to vapor between them. "You can't buy your way back," she said. "I know." "Coffee doesn't fix what you did." "I know that too." She looked at him. The exhaustion in his face was real, the way he was standing, not with the 52nd floor posture, not the boardroom architecture, just standing, coat insufficient, holding his own coffee, on a sidewalk in the cold because he had apparently decided this was where he needed to be. "I'm still angry," she said. "I know. I'm going to be angry for a while longer." "All right." She looked at her coffee cup, back at him. "I was going to run." "I know. I'll go." "I didn't say go." She looked at the park entrance at the end of the block, back at him. "I said I was going to run." She paused. "You're wearing the wrong shoes." He looked down at his dress shoes, back at her. Something moved in his face, not the ghost smile, not the controlled expression, something she hadn't seen before, which was saying something after 6 weeks and a federal investigation and a crisis that had reorganized both their lives. Something that looked unexpectedly like hope. "I'll manage," he said. "You'll ruin them. They're replaceable." She looked at him for another moment. Then she turned and started walking toward the park entrance, and she heard him fall into step beside her. The sound of expensive dress shoes on November pavement, completely wrong for the surface, completely wrong for the weather, completely wrong in every practical sense. She didn't tell him to go back. They walked in silence for half a block, their breath making matching clouds in the cold air. And the city was waking up around them in its indifferent, enormous way. And somewhere in the silence she understood that she was not yet at the end of the anger, and also that she was moving slowly, in a direction she had not fully chosen yet, but had not turned away from either. That was not resolution. She knew that. It was something earlier than resolution, the raw material of it, the thing that required time and evidence and the particular patience she usually reserved for audit trails. She applied it to this instead. The park entrance came up on their left, and she went through it, and he went through it beside her, dress shoes on the path, coat not warm enough, saying, "Nothing for the first quarter mile." That was how she ran. No headphones, no conversation, just the sound of her feet and her breath, and the park in the early cold, the trees stripped to their functional selves, branches black against a sky that hadn't yet decided on a color. She had learned years ago that the first quarter mile was where the mind tried to keep talking, and that if you let it, you lost the thing running was actually for. So she had built the discipline of silence into the first stretch. You ran and you breathed and you let the morning be what it was. Luca kept up. She'd half expected him not to. Dress shoes on park path, no preparation, the physical equivalent of arriving to a deposition without documents. But he found her pace within the first 100 yards and held it, his breathing adjusting, and she heard him behind her left shoulder the way you heard something you didn't want to look at directly because looking would require deciding what you thought about it. At the quarter mile, she let herself speak. You should have called first. You wouldn't have answered. She didn't contradict that because it was probably true. She kept running. What do you want to say that you couldn't say in a text? Everything. A beat. Nothing that fits in a text. Try. He was quiet for a moment. The path curved and she leaned into it, and he did the same, and their footsteps made an uneven rhythm, his dress shoes a different sound against the pavement than her running shoes, the particular absurdity of it striking her again and then releasing. I want to tell you that the reason I did it, engineering the circumstances, was real, he said. His breath was even but costing him something. Not an excuse, a reason. There's a difference. I know the difference. The reason was that I had watched you work from a distance for 2 years. The Callaway audit, the Reinhold case, 3 separate depositions that I had professional interest in tracking. And I understood that you were someone who built things that held, who didn't cut corners when corners would have been easier. He paused. I had a problem that required that. I also... a beat. I had been alone in a specific way for a very long time, and I recognized something in your work that I recognized in myself. And I wanted to meet you. Both of those things were true at the same time. She ran for a moment without responding. The wanting to meet me part. That's the part that wasn't clean. Yes. Because you could have contacted me professionally, a direct referral, standard intake. Yes. And you chose not to because you weren't sure I'd take the engagement if it came directly from you. A longer pause. Yes. So the arrangement of circumstances was about removing the risk that I'd say no. He didn't answer. That was its own answer. She ran. The path straightened and the early light was coming through the stripped trees at a low angle, hitting the pavement in long, pale strips, and a jogger passed them going the other direction and didn't look at either of them, which was New York doing its fundamental courtesy of pretending everyone was alone. The thing about taking away someone's choice, she said, and her breath was even, the run at her natural pace now, the place where she could talk without losing the rhythm. It's not always about the outcome. Sometimes the outcome would have been the same. I might have taken the engagement through standard intake. I might have ended up in the same place. She paused. But I would have gotten there as myself, making my own assessment, my own call. She looked ahead at the path. What you did was decide that your judgment about what was good for me was more important than my ability to choose it. Silence. The dress shoes on the path. That's the thing I can't walk past easily, she said. Not the manipulation in a scheming sense, the assumption underneath it. I know. His voice was quiet, running quiet, the particular register of words delivered without excess breath. I knew it when I did it. I did it anyway because I hadn't wanted something in a long time, Vivian. I had forgotten what it felt like to want something I couldn't simply acquire or arrange or negotiate. And when I felt it, I handled it the only way I knew how. She let that sit for 30 yards. 40. That's the most honest thing you've said to me, she said. I've tried to be honest with you. You've tried to be honest about the things that were safe to be honest about. She wasn't unkind about it, just precise. That was the first honest thing about the unsafe part. They ran. The park opened up into a wider section, the reservoir to the left, the water flat and gray, and very still in the morning cold. She slowed slightly without deciding to, and he matched it. The audit is over, she said. Frost has what he needs. Gentry is in protection. The Vanek investigation is federal, which means it's out of both our hands in the way things are out of your hands when they become federal. She paused. The professional relationship between us is closed. Yes. So what you're asking for, showing up on my sidewalk at 6:40 in the morning, that's not professional. No. It's personal. Yes. She stopped running. It was abrupt enough that he went 2 steps past her before he stopped, turned, stood facing her on the reservoir path with his inadequate coat and his ruined shoes and his honest face in the early light. And she stood looking at him with her hands loose at her sides and her breath making small clouds between them. I'm still angry, she said. I told you that this morning, and it's still true. I know. And I don't have a version of this where what you did becomes all right. It doesn't become all right. It's a thing that happened, and it has a shape, and that shape doesn't disappear. I'm not asking you to make it disappear. What are you asking? He looked at her. The controlled face was gone. She couldn't find it anywhere. What was there instead was the face from the music room, the face from her kitchen at 7 in the morning, the face that had been telling the truth about things since before she'd known what to do with it. I'm asking for the chance to be someone you chose, knowing everything. Not because I arranged the circumstances, but because you decided. He held her gaze. The circumstances now are exactly what they are. I'm standing in front of you in the wrong shoes and the wrong coat, having told you everything true. I know how to tell you. That's not arrangement. That's just... He stopped. This. She looked at him. The reservoir was gray and still to their left, and the trees were black and stripped, and the city was waking up somewhere beyond the park's edges. And she was standing on a running path in November having a conversation that had no audit trail, no evidence package, no methodology to tell her the right conclusion. She had only what she could see, which was a man who was tired and cold and standing in the wrong shoes and not performing any of it. I need more time, she said. All right, not an answer, just time. I understand the difference. She looked at him for another moment. Then she turned and started running again, and she heard him fall back into step, and they ran the rest of the loop without talking. And when they came back to the park entrance and the street beyond it, and her building's door visible 40 yards away, she stopped. Go get proper shoes, she said. He looked down at the wreckage of his dress shoes. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Yes. And a coat that's actually rated for this weather. I have one. Wear it. She paused. I'll call you when I'm ready. He nodded. That was all. One nod, no push, no negotiation. He accepted the terms because they were her terms, and she'd stated them freely, and he understood by now, at whatever cost it had taken him to understand it, that her terms were the only terms that mattered. She went into her building. She didn't watch him go, but she stood in the elevator and felt the cold she'd carried in from outside and thought about the wrong shoes on the reservoir path, and the particular dignity of a man who had stopped trying to arrange anything and had just shown up as what he was. She went upstairs and showered and made coffee and went to work. 3 weeks. That was what it took. Not because she was testing him, not as a deliberate exercise in making him wait. That wasn't who she was. It was simply the honest duration of what she needed to work through, the real time required to sit with the anger until it changed shape, to examine the thing underneath it without flinching, to arrive at what she actually thought rather than what she was supposed to think. She worked. Boston client, forensic review of the acquisition target, clean work that required full attention, and got it. She ran every morning. She had dinner with Darcy twice, said nothing about any of it, listened to Darcy talk about the wedding planning with the particular radiant energy of someone whose future was assembling itself exactly as desired. She thought about the future, what it looked like, whether the version of it she'd been building, the 14th floor, the Greek diner coffee, the apartment with the lucky plant, the clean, satisfying work of following evidence to the truth, whether that version was complete as it stood or whether it had been all along missing a dimension she hadn't let herself need. She thought about what it meant to trust someone who had already shown you the precise manner in which they would fail you. Whether the showing was itself a kind of information, whether a person who had spent years controlling everything and had responded to the experience of wanting something they couldn't control by doing something wrong was the same as a person who would always do that, or whether it was a person in the process of learning something very difficult. She had built her career on not confusing what she wanted to find with what the evidence actually showed. She applied that here. The evidence was this. He had told her the truth when he could have continued to conceal it. He had drawn a line to protect her professional exposure when drawing no line would have benefited him. He had stood on her sidewalk in November in inadequate clothing and said, I had forgotten what it felt like to want something I couldn't simply arrange, and she had been reading people for 15 years, and she knew the sound of a true thing. Evidence weighed, conclusion reached, action pending. She called him on a Sunday afternoon, 3 weeks and 2 days after the park. He answered on the second ring. Vivian, I've been thinking about what you said, she said. On the path. Yes. That you wanted the chance to be someone I chose, knowing everything. Yes, I know everything. She paused. That part is true. The question was whether what I know adds up to something I'm willing to move toward. She looked at the window, the Sunday afternoon light, the plant on the sill that had made it to November through pure unreasonable persistence. It does. It adds up to that. I'm not saying it's simple, and I'm not saying the shape of what happened disappears. I'm saying I'm willing to move toward it anyway. Silence. Not the controlled kind, the other kind. Vivian, he said, and something in the way he said it, not relief, not victory, something quieter and more costly than both, made her close her eyes for a second. Don't make it into more than it is yet, she said. It's a beginning, that's all. That's enough. It's going to require, she paused, things I'm going to need from you that you've never been asked for. Transparency, not strategic transparency, the kind that costs you something. I know, and the other side of your life, the part that isn't Meridian Pacific and legitimate investment portfolios. At some point, that becomes something we have to talk about honestly. A pause. Longer. Yes. Not today, she said. But at some point. At some point, he agreed. On your timeline. Our timeline, she said. When it's time. She heard him breathe on the other end of the phone. Just breathe. In, out, the ordinary sound of a person who was present. All right, he said. I'll see you this week, she said. We'll have dinner. Yes. Somewhere I choose. Of course. She almost smiled. Good night, Luca. Good night, Vivian. She hung up and sat in her Sunday apartment and looked at the November light and let the beginning be exactly what it was. Small, fragile, costly, and real. The gallery opening was Darcy's idea, which meant it happened with the particular unstoppable momentum of things Darcy decided. The first Friday of December, a gallery in Chelsea that a friend of Preston's owned or co-owned or had invested in, the distinction lost somewhere in the social constellation of the Whitmore world. Vivian went because Darcy asked and because she had spent enough of her life finding reasons to stand at the edge of things that weren't wrong to be part of. She went with Luca. That was new. 3 weeks of dinners and 2 afternoons in the park, and 1 evening at his apartment where he'd cooked. Actually cooked, which had surprised her, and she'd told him so, and he'd said my mother insisted on that too, same flat delivery as the piano comment, and she'd felt the smile come up before she could decide about it. 3 weeks of learning the ordinary texture of a person outside of crisis, the way a face looked when nothing was at stake, the particular quality of a man at rest. She had not yet seen the other side of his life up close. He had not offered, and she had not asked, and they had, by unspoken agreement, allowed this 3 weeks to be what it was. A controlled experiment in ordinary, in the possible, in what it looked like when 2 people chose each other in daylight rather than emergency. At the gallery, he held her coat. She noted this as data, not performance, the automatic action of someone to whom it was instinctive, a thing so practiced it had become nature. She noted what it did and did not tell her about him and filed it in the growing archive. The gallery was the kind of Chelsea space that had once been industrial and had been converted with enough money to honor the bones while changing everything else. High ceilings, raw concrete softened by careful lighting, art on walls that had probably once held machinery. Darcy was everywhere, radiant in green, Preston 2 steps behind her doing the supportive presence thing that Vivian had recalibrated her opinion of over the last 2 months, understanding it now as genuine rather than performed. She and Luca moved through the rooms. They talked to people, separately, together, the natural traffic of a gallery opening where conversation formed and dissolved without weight. He was good in this context, she'd learned, not the boardroom version or the underworld version, but a third thing, quieter and more observant, someone who listened more than he spoke and asked questions that were real questions. She watched him across a room talking to an artist whose work she'd been looking at, a photographer, young, visibly nervous in the way emerging artists were nervous at their own openings. And she watched Luca say something that made the photographer's shoulders drop, the defensive posture releasing, the nervousness converting into the easier energy of someone who'd been seen rather than assessed. Whatever Luca had said was real, she could tell from the distance. She went back to looking at the photographs. The exhibition was organized around the theme of accidental moments. The photographer's stated interest in the images that happened between the intended ones, the frames that existed because the camera was already up when something unplanned occurred. Most of them were street photography, New York and elsewhere, the candid capture of people in the spaces between their public performances. She was looking at a photograph of two strangers on a subway platform, caught mid-collision, both of them in the process of reacting to impact, faces not yet assembled into the apologetic social expression that would follow. Raw reaction, pure and unguarded, when Darcy appeared at her shoulder. "There's one you need to see," Darcy said. Her voice had something in it that Vivian couldn't read immediately. "Back room. Come." She followed Darcy through the gallery to a smaller room at the back, lower ceilings, more intimate. 4 large photographs, each 3 feet across. The third one stopped her. It was in black and white, high contrast, the aesthetic of a skilled photographer who understood how light made architecture of ordinary spaces. The location was immediately recognizable. The corridor at the Whitmore estate, the long hallway with the portraits and the particular angle of the event lighting cutting across the marble floor. 2 figures in the frame. A woman in a champagne-stained dress, caught in the exact moment of stepping back from a collision, her chin slightly up, her expression caught between surprise and the beginning of composure. A man beside her, taller, one hand still extended from the reflexive steadying gesture of an instant before, his face turned toward her at an angle that showed his profile clearly. The moment when champagne had spilled. The exact moment when neither of them had yet decided what the moment would be. Vivian stood looking at it for a long time. Darcy said quietly, "Preston knew the photographer had been hired for the event. I asked if there was anything from the corridor. I thought—" She paused. "I just thought you should see it." The caption card on the wall beside the photograph read, in the spare gallery font, "The beginning." She stood there. The photograph was precise in a way that felt unfair, the way it had caught both of them in their raw state, before the armor went back up, before either of them had made any choice about the other. Just 2 people in a corridor, collision just occurred, looking at each other with no idea yet what they were looking at. She heard him behind her before he spoke. The particular quality of his presence in a room, the thing she'd learned to recognize. He stood beside her and looked at the photograph. She could hear him breathing, slow, even. She kept her eyes on the photograph. "We look surprised," she said. "We were." "You positioned yourself," she said. "In the corridor, you knew I'd come that direction." "Yes, but not—" She looked at it. The expression on his face in the photograph, the man who had engineered the encounter, caught in the millisecond after the champagne spilled when control had briefly failed and something unplanned had appeared on his face. "You didn't plan that?" "No." His voice was very quiet. "That part I didn't plan." She looked at what was on his face in the photograph. She had the professional vocabulary for reading faces, had spent 15 years doing it, and she knew what she was looking at in the moment the camera had caught. A man who had arranged something and then been genuinely struck by it. The collision of the controlled and the uncontrollable, visible in a fraction of a second in a corridor in the Hamptons. "This is what it looked like," she said. Not a question. "Yes." She stood with that for another moment. Then she turned to look at him directly, the real him standing beside her rather than the photograph. And he was looking at her with the same expression, not the same face. He was older and more tired, and had come through something difficult, and it showed. But the same essential thing underneath it, the thing that didn't have a professional category. "I want a print of it," she said. Something moved through his face. "I'll get you one." "For my office," she said. "So I remember what everything looks like before the armor goes up." He looked at her. including yourself. Especially myself. She held his gaze. I'm not easy, Luca. I need you to know that fully. Not the version you observe from a distance for 2 years. The version that exists in the same space as you, with all the edges and the difficulty, and the fact that I will call you on every single thing that isn't honest. I know. And the other side of your life. The part we haven't talked about yet. That conversation is going to come, and it is going to be hard, and there are going to be things in it that I'm not able to accept, and we are going to have to face that without either of us walking away from it before we've actually faced it. Yes, he said, simply. Yes. You say that like it's not terrifying. It is terrifying. His voice was level. It's also the only version of this I want. He paused. I'm done with the version where I manage everything at a distance, where nothing gets close enough to change me. He looked at the photograph, then back at her. You've already changed me. The question is whether I'm worth the cost of that. She looked at him. 15 years of reading evidence. 15 years of following the trail from the surface to the truth. 15 years of knowing that the most dangerous moment was when you found someone you wanted to trust, and that the only answer to that danger was not the elimination of trust, but the careful, evidence-based, eyes-open practice of it. She thought about the piano in the Whitmore music room, the voice on the phone at 6:47 in the morning, the 11 days of silence that hadn't felt like absence, the wrong shoes on the reservoir path, the coffee from the Greek diner, delivered and unaddressed, which was its own kind of honesty. She thought about the photograph, the millisecond when neither of them had been performing anything. Yes, she said, you're worth the cost. He reached out and took her hand. Not a grand gesture, just that, his hand finding hers in the quiet gallery room, warm and certain, the way you held something you understood the value of. She let him. What? The dinner that followed was at a place she'd chosen, a small Italian restaurant in the West Village, not expensive by his standards, but right by hers. Good food and low lighting and the particular noise of a Friday evening, people around them in their own lives and conversations, the city doing what it always did. They sat at a corner table and ate pasta and drank wine and talked the way they had been learning to talk these past 3 weeks. Not about crisis, not about forensic evidence, not about the things that had brought them together, but about the ordinary territory of two people trying to understand each other. His mother, who had lived in Rome and died 6 years ago and had in fact been formidable about both piano and cooking and a dozen other things he had either obeyed or fought and couldn't always remember which now. Her father, who had been a math teacher in a town in Ohio where numbers were the one clean language she'd trusted before she'd understood what the world outside it contained. She told him about the 4 months of piano lessons. He told her what the piece had been that night in the music room. Not classical, his own, something he'd been working on for 2 years in the odd private hours when he was in a space with a piano and no one watching. She said she hadn't known it was original. He said most people didn't notice whether music was original or not. They just responded to whether it was true. She said she'd responded to it as true. He looked at her across the restaurant table and said yes, he knew, he'd been watching. She should have found that unsettling. She found it something else. The check came and she reached for it, and he didn't protest, which she respected. He'd learned by now that certain gestures were not about money, but about the precise maintenance of her own agency in the terms of things. And the learning was visible, the effort of a man recalibrating instincts that had been in place for decades. On the sidewalk outside the restaurant, the cold was real now, December cold, the first suggestion of what the winter would actually be. She had the right coat. He had the better coat she'd told him to wear, which was a small private satisfaction she allowed herself. They walked toward the corner where they'd get separate cabs. That was still the arrangement. She'd kept her apartment inviolate so far. They were moving slowly by his standards, and she understood he experienced it as slowly, but he'd adapted without resentment, and that adaptation itself was data she'd filed carefully. At the corner, she stopped. The conversation we haven't had yet, she said, about the other side of your life. He met her eyes. Yes, I want to have it soon, not to hurry towards something difficult, because I think we're ready for it, and I think waiting is its own kind of management. She held his gaze. I don't want to manage anything between us. He nodded. Next week. Your office, your territory. She paused. The full version. The full version, he said. She looked at him, in the cold, in the December street light, with the city around them in its indifferent November life, the two of them standing at a corner in the middle of it. She thought about how much had happened in the 14 weeks since a champagne glass had tipped in a corridor, and two strangers had looked at each other in the moment before either of them was ready. She thought about the photograph and the caption card. The beginning. She thought about how beginnings were not comfortable things, how they required the sustained willingness to stay present in the not yet known, to resist the professional impulse to resolve everything before it was ready to be resolved, to allow the evidence to accumulate at its own pace, and trust the methodology enough to wait for the conclusion it was actually building toward. She had built her career on exactly that patience, on the understanding that the truth didn't rush and couldn't be forced, and would reveal itself completely only to the person willing to stay in the room with the incomplete picture long enough. She looked at Luca Moretti in the December cold. Expensive coat, insufficient for his usual composure in the right way. The composure was there but edited, reduced to something that left room for the rest of his face, the parts he'd been learning to let out of the architecture. The dark eyes that had been paying attention to her since before she'd known she was being watched, which still complicated her, which she'd decided to hold as complicated rather than resolved. "Good night," she said. "Good night." He paused. The ghost smile, but complete now, or close to it, the most finished version she'd seen. "Thank you for dinner." "You're welcome." She hailed a cab. He held the door for her. The automatic thing, instinct, and she let it be instinct, not a statement, not a gesture to analyze, just the texture of who he was, being who he was, next to her who she was. She got in. The cab pulled away. She looked out the window at the city going past. The light and the cold and the particular restless life of Manhattan in December, people on sidewalks with their breath making small clouds and their shoulders up against the season, all of them in their own stories moving in their own directions. She looked at her hands in her lap. Thought about the hand in the gallery room, warm and certain. Thought about 14 weeks that had begun with cold champagne and a corridor and two people who had not yet understood what they were looking at. She looked out at the city she had lived inside for 15 years, which she thought she understood, which turned out to contain things she hadn't mapped yet. She thought, beginning. She thought, all right. The cab moved uptown through the December city, and the light slid past the window, and she sat with the incomplete picture with the patience she had learned to have for the truth, not rushing it, not forcing the resolution, allowing it to be exactly as far along as it was and no further. Knowing that the conclusion was there somewhere in the accumulating evidence, that it would show itself fully when it was ready, that the methodology she'd spent 15 years building was good enough to trust. She had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. She had done it with her eyes open. That was enough, for now. That was the whole of what a beginning needed to be. The cab turned onto her street and pulled up to her building, and she paid and stepped out into the cold and looked up at the sky above the buildings. The particular city sky, never dark, always that amber gray of ambient light and density, the stars invisible but there somewhere above it. She went inside. She went upstairs. She made tea instead of coffee, which was the late evening version of herself, and she sat at her kitchen table and looked at the plant on the windowsill that had made it to December through nothing but stubbornness and the refusal to accept that it should have died 3 times over by now. She looked at it for a while. Then she took out her phone and texted him 2 words. "Next week." The reply came in 40 seconds. 1 word. "Ready." She put the phone down. She drank her tea. She looked at the city outside her window and the plant on the sill and the kitchen that was her ordinary life, which had changed shape in 14 weeks in ways she hadn't chosen and could not entirely separate. And she understood that this was what it looked like. Not the clean resolution, not the perfectly closed case, not the evidence package with every thread tied off. This was the other kind of truth. The kind that didn't resolve into a final document, but kept moving, kept requiring your attention, kept asking you to be present in it, without the safety of methodology and the comfort of the answerable question. She had spent 15 years being very good at that other kind of truth, the provable kind, She was learning at the corner table in a West Village restaurant and on a reservoir path in inadequate shoes and in a gallery room in front of a photograph taken by accident. How to be present in this kind, too. It was harder. It cost more. The exposure was real and unmanageable and permanent. She thought she was up to it. She finished her tea. She turned off the kitchen light. She went to bed in her apartment in the city she'd chosen, in the life she'd built, which had a new shape now that she was still mapping, and she lay in the dark and breathed and let the evening settle into what it was. Somewhere on the other side of Manhattan, in a corner office on the 52nd floor, or wherever he actually rested when the day was done, a man who had controlled everything was learning to hold something he couldn't control. She thought about that. She let it be the last thought. She slept.